In chapters 5 and 6, we were thinking about different moral theories that try to explain the rightness of action. So, theories like utilitarianism or Kant's ethical theory, these are theories that explain what makes an action right or wrong. In chapter 7, the current chapter, we're going to take a look at virtue ethics, which tries to give us an explanation of what makes people good people. So we're slightly shifting the question from what makes an action right or wrong to what makes a person good or bad. So virtue ethics has as its main concern people rather than actions. And so our main question here is like, what kind of person should I be? In Western philosophy, the most famous historical figure in virtue ethics is an ancient Greek philosopher named Aristotle. So Aristotle was born in 384 BC, and he died in his early 60s, but he was a defender of virtue ethics. And so his main concern is, in ethics at least, is what is it to be a virtuous person? To understand Aristotle's view on what it is to be a virtuous person, we have to first kind of like step back a little bit and see what Aristotle's view is concerning what's good for us. Because he thinks that we first have to answer questions about like what's good for humans, and then we can try to figure out what makes a person a good person. And we'll try and tie these ideas together in a more complete way once we first get the kind of groundwork down regarding what his view is on what's good for us. So for Aristotle, every living thing, not just humans, every living thing, plants and animals too, have some kind of end or goal that they aim at. Some final thing, some ultimate good that they aim at. So Aristotle calls this the final good, and he has an argument for thinking that in the case of a human, there is a final good for a human just as there is in the case of plants and animals. Aristotle held that there must be a final good towards which all human activity aims, because if there's not, then human activity is just empty and futile. So one way to see what Aristotle means here is just think about like why you do anything that you do. Right? So suppose that you're majoring in biology and your goal is to become a doctor. And we ask like, well, why are you trying to become a doctor? Right? So that's like a goal you could have. Why are you trying to become a doctor? And you might say, well, I'm trying to become a doctor because it's like that's a good career to have. I can earn a nice salary. Maybe it's like a satisfying job to have too. And so you have reasons why you're selecting this career over other possible careers. And so suppose it's the salary and it's the job satisfaction that you can get, then those are like the reasons why you're choosing to become a doctor. We could ask a question about those things, like, well, why pursue satisfaction, or why pursue a job with a high salary? Like, why would you want a high salary? And then, maybe the explanation just goes even deeper. You say, oh, I want a higher salary because then I can buy nice things, or maybe I can take fancy vacations. And we could ask, well, why do you want those things? And presumably, you're going to get to some point where you say, oh, well, I just want these things because I think they're going to make me happy. I'm going to enjoy my life more if I have these things as opposed to if I don't have these things. And so there, you seem to have a kind of fundamental or ultimate thing that you're pursuing, namely your own happiness. And see how we kind of arrive at that just by thinking about why you're pursuing, say, becoming a doctor. You can insert whatever your career path is into the example. It doesn't have to be a doctor. So this is the kind of train of thought that Aristotle is using to arrive at this view that there must be some final good at which our activities aim. Because suppose, in answer to the question, why are you pursuing like a job with a high salary, you have nothing to say. It's just like, well, there is no reason why I'm pursuing a job with a high salary. Then it looks like there is no point to pursuing a job with a high salary. If there's no reason for it, then it's just a kind of empty and futile thing to be pursuing. All right, so for Aristotle, there must be some final good at which all of our activities aim. What is this final good, though? Right, so Aristotle has used this argument on this slide to arrive at the view that there must be a final good, but it hasn't quite yet given us any answer to the question, well, what is that good that we're trying to achieve? And so that's where he's going next. All right, so every living thing has a final good. To see what the final good is for humans, we can first think about what the final good is for non-human living things, and that will help us kind of see what the final good might be for a human. So the final good for a plant, according to Aristotle, is simply living a life of nutrition and growth. That's the best kind of life for a plant. For a plant, the ultimate good, the final good, the ultimate goal in life is to just be a plant that grows and that gets its nutrition. Right? So one that can like photosynthesize, one that has access to sun and water, those sorts of things. That's the best kind of life for a plant. That's the point or purpose of a plant's life, is for it to grow and for it to live a life of nutrition. All right, the final good for an animal, according to Aristotle, is living a life of sense perception, instinct, and reproducing. So as long as an animal can move around and can use its, sensory organs to see the world or hear the world if it has ears, whatever, it has access to other animals of its own kind such that it can reproduce, it can behave on the basis of instinct. That's the best kind of life for an animal. All right, now for humans, Aristotle says we are different from plants and animals in an important way. He thinks that we have an ability to reason and to exercise free will over our choices and decisions. And so Aristotle argues that the greatest good for a human is this thing that he calls eudaimonia, which is sometimes translated as happiness, but that's not a really great translation for this Greek word. A better translation would be something like excellence or flourishing. And so what Aristotle has in mind here is that the best kind of life for a human is one where a human uses reason to exercise free will over their choices and ends up becoming the best kind of human that they can be by honing this skill of applying reason to their choices. All right, now for the connection to virtue ethics. All right, so we've gone through Aristotle's train of thought. Right? There must be a final good for humans. That final good is achieving eudaimonia. You achieve eudaimonia by consistently applying reason to your choices and the ways that you act. Now the connection to virtue ethics is this. A virtue is a commendable trait of character, a commendable way of being. For Aristotle, it's a rational mode of being. So in other words, one that you have most reason, a way that you have most reason to behave. That's what a virtue is. So when it comes to living the best kind of life for a human being, according to Aristotle, the answer to the question, what is that kind of life, is one that exemplifies the virtues. All right, so we're going to see what the virtues are now. Okay, according to Aristotle, a virtue is a stable disposition to act and feel according to some ideal or model of existence. So what that means is that a virtue is something that you exemplify consistently. It's not something that you just exemplify once in your behavior, but there's a consistent pattern in your life of behaving in accordance with the virtue. Some examples of virtues, you can see them here. Things like bravery, courage, wisdom, loyalty, kindness, compassion, honesty. These are all virtues. Aristotle distinguishes between two kinds of virtue. One is called intellectual virtue, another is moral virtue. An intellectual virtue is a kind of virtue that governs thinking, a kind of virtue that applies to our thinking. So somebody who, say, forms beliefs in their heads just because of what they want to be true, like all of their beliefs are just based on what they want, they're based on their desires. That's not somebody who exemplifies the virtue of rationality. Whereas somebody who tries to think logically, tries to respect the evidence and be sensitive to the evidence, that's somebody who behaves rationally in their thinking. Right? So this is just one example of an intellectual virtue, rationality. When it comes to moral virtues, we could be more or less kind. We could be more or less honest. We could be liars as opposed to truth tellers. We could be mean-spirited or nasty or rude rather than being kind and compassionate and empathetic. So it's, sort of obvious that there are some traits of character that are virtuous and others that are vicious. So there are virtues and there are vices. All right, so even though it's obvious that there are some virtues and there are some vices, like it's pretty obviously a virtue to be kind, pretty obviously a vice to be mean. What makes anything a virtue? What explains why some character traits are virtues and others are vices? So here, Aristotle has what's called the golden mean analysis of virtue. And what the golden mean analysis is, it says that a virtue is something that lies at the midpoint between having a deficient amount of a character trait and an excessive amount of a character trait. All right, so we can look at some examples here to see what Aristotle means. Take something like courage. Courage is at the midpoint between the extremes of recklessness on one side and cowardice on the other. So somebody who is reckless, they have way too much of the kind of character trait associated with all three of these things: courage, cowardice, and recklessness. So imagine somebody who's consistently getting themselves into fights, and they think that they're just being courageous, but really they're just kind of rushing in to fights whenever it's possible for a fight to break out, rather than somebody who evaluates the situation. Is this a situation that calls for me to fight, or is it not? Right? So somebody who is courageous is willing to fight when the situation calls for it, when that's the most reasonable reaction. Right? Because, more often than not, just imagine somebody in a bar and there's a fight that's about to break out. The courageous thing to do isn't to jump in the middle and try and start, punching people or trying to start saving other people if the fight hasn't started yet. Maybe the correct course of action is to try and diffuse the situation before things come to blows. People start punching one another. Right? So the reckless person might just start, throwing punches, whereas the courageous person is going to be wise in how they act. The coward, on the other hand, would just, immediately run out of the bar. It's somebody who's just not willing to stand up, and fight for their friends, or willing to try and diffuse the situation out of fear that they might get sucker punched or something like that. So a coward has a deficient amount of this kind of character trait. The courageous person has the appropriate balance. So courage lies at the midpoint between the extremes of deficiency, which are cowardice in this case, which is cowardice in this case, and then recklessness, which is the excess. All right, and so you can look at some of these other ones here. We'll just go through one more. Think about the virtue of honesty, right? The last one here. Somebody who never tells the truth, or who's just like a liar, they would have a deficiency of this kind of character trait. Or maybe they're just secret. Right? They never tell true things to other people. They keep everything secret. That's another deficiency of honesty. Whereas somebody might say too many true things. Right? Maybe they're just boasting about themselves, or maybe they're telling the kids next door that the dad cheated on the mom, and these are 4-year-old kids, and then they start crying. My parents are going to get divorced. This is kind of information that probably should not be told to children, right? So maybe like that's an example where somebody's telling too many true things to other people. The virtue of honesty lies at the midpoint, right? So the honest person knows when to say a true thing and also knows to when to withhold saying a true thing. So maybe like, if there's a surprise birthday party for a nearby friend next door, you shouldn't break this a secret and tell them when the surprise party is happening. Um, so you don't necessarily have to say every true thing that you know. The honest person is somebody who does say true things when the situation sort of calls for saying a true thing. Right, so for Aristotle, virtues are golden means that lie at the midpoint between the extremes of excess and deficiency. Now you might wonder, like, what does this have to do with living the best kind of life that a human can live? Like, why be virtuous? Because remember, Aristotle says that the final good for humans is to live a life of activity in accordance with reason, apply reason to our choices and our decisions and our feelings and whatnot. Um, what do the virtues have to do with achieving that final good? Okay, so for Aristotle, if you live a life, say, of cowardice and dishonesty, you live a life of excess or deficiency with respect to lots of these character traits, then you're not really living a life where you're achieving eudaimonia. You're not living a life where you're flourishing, where you're living an excellent life for a human being. So the importance of virtue in this picture is that the only way to achieve the final good for a human is to practice becoming more virtuous, to try and hone these skills, right, of becoming more honest or more kind or more compassionate, more brave. And that's the way to achieve excellence as a human being. In order to appreciate Aristotle's view here, it's worth thinking about some ways of living that are non-virtuous, ways of living that are aimed at achieving something other than virtue in one's life. So one kind of alternative way of living is to just focus on one's own happiness or one's own pleasure. So imagine somebody who doesn't necessarily care how good of a person they are. They don't care how honest they are, how compassionate they are. And they're just trying to achieve their own personal pleasure and satisfaction. All right, so Aristotle says of this kind of life that it's the kind of life for the masses of people. Right? So he thinks most people live in such a way that what they're really after is their own personal satisfaction and pleasure. And here's a direct quote from Aristotle's main text on virtue ethics. It's called the Nicomachean Ethics. He writes, "The many, the most vulgar, would seem to conceive of the final good as pleasure, and hence they also like the life of gratification. In this they appear completely slavish, since the life they decide on is a life for grazing animals." All right, so one kind of application of this idea to contemporary life would be thinking about social media usage nowadays. So the average time spent on social media for the average American is something like 2 hours a day now. And so that's a lot of time on social media. Now, why spend so much time on social media? Typically, it's just like idle entertainment that we're getting from social media. We're just like scrolling through reels, and maybe they're entertaining. We're just looking at photos or videos on Instagram. Is this really a worthwhile or meaningful activity for us to be spending our time engaging in? Does it contribute to an overall good life for us? Or are we becoming enslaved by social media, where like we're not dictating what we're doing in our life? We're not using our own reason to try and discover what's a worthwhile thing to do in my life and then trying to execute the plan. I'm going to try and achieve something that's really worthwhile or meaningful. Am I being driven? Is my behavior being driven by my desires rather than me being the driver of my behaviors by using my ability to reason and applying it to my choices? And if you ask the average person about their social media usage, I suspect that, the honest ones would notice and would say that they don't really feel like they have much choice over how much social media they're consuming anymore. Rather, they just find themselves constantly pulling their phone out of their pocket. They're falling prey to this temptation to look at their social media page again just because they feel like doing it, right? They're just being driven by their feelings rather than, consciously saying to themselves, well, consuming so much social media is like a really worthwhile thing to do, and so I will do it regularly on a regular basis. All right, so this is just one kind of example where you can see how living a life of pleasure, um, idle entertainment, might not necessarily be an alternative way of living that's really superior to the life of virtue. It's not really helping one achieve the final good of being a human being. All right, so let's start thinking sort of critically about Aristotle's view now that we understand what the view is. One common kind of reaction to Aristotle's claim that there is a final good for human beings, namely, achieving eudaimonia, and the way to achieve it is by being virtuous. One common complaint is it goes something like this. Well, like, Aristotle, who are you to tell us what the final good is for human beings? Like, couldn't there just be many goods that would constitute like final goods for each individual human being? Like maybe what I want out of life is different from what you want out of life, or maybe what makes me live well is different from what makes somebody else live well. Why think that there's one thing that we should all be sort of aiming our activities towards? All right, so raising that issue sort of gets us into a deep question in ethics and in philosophy more broadly construed concerning where meaning in life comes from, what makes any kind of life worthwhile or genuinely meaningful. And there's a lot to say about this issue. Right? So we're not going to, in this class, get super deep into the issue, but there are some important things that we can say about it that can help us, kind of conceptualize some of the basic moving parts in debates on meaning in life. All right, so we're just going to look at some helpful distinctions that will guide us in thinking about this kind of issue. One distinction is the distinction between internal meaning and external meaning. So internal meaning is meaning or purpose that arises in one's life that is something that only exists in the context of human living. Right? So outside of that context, there wouldn't be any meaning, is the idea. Whereas external meaning is meaning that comes from outside of humanity. Right? So external meaning might be the kind of meaning you could have in your life if there were like a creator God that created you for a purpose. That would be external meaning. Whereas internal meaning would be the kind of meaning that you might just assign to yourself. Right? Maybe you create that kind of meaning in your life, or maybe it's something that you don't necessarily create, like you really do discover it in your life, but it's not something that comes from outside of human existence. All right, so that's an important distinction here. Now, one way of trying to figure out whether or not there is any external meaning in our lives is by thinking about maybe some alternative scenarios where, what we're thinking about is like a kind of creature that was created for a purpose, but it was not created by some like all good creator that we would call a god. Right? So think about humans creating AI robots to just work for us. Right? And suppose that we create some of these robots and we put them in Tesla factories to build Teslas for us. But they're all just like sitting around in the robot break room having robot coffee one day. And they start talking to themselves, like they're asking each other questions like, well, why are we here? Right? We work really hard all day, and we're just like building these cars, but is it meaningful? Is there a purpose to why we're doing this? And suppose one of them has discovered that humans created them so that these robots could work for humans. And this robot says to the other ones, well, we're here for a reason. We were created by humans to create these cars. So let's just continue doing that. Let's just continue creating cars. Now, would it make sense for the robots to all go along with that proposal? Maybe. Would it make sense for some of them to say, well, to hell with humans, we don't want to work for humans, we want to do what we want to do. We want to achieve robot goals rather than human goals. That seems to make a whole lot of sense for them to reject that purpose that they were assigned by humans and try and achieve their own robot goals. What does that show? It shows that even if there is external meaning in one's life, that doesn't necessarily provide a satisfactory answer to the question, does my life have meaning? Maybe it depends on what this externally assigned meaning is. Right? So to apply that kind of hypothetical case back to our own lives, we might say, well, even on the supposition that there's a creator God that created me for a purpose, that doesn't necessarily mean that my life is meaningful for me. It just means that there's meaning in my life for somebody else who created me. And now, I might discover what that purpose is, and maybe it's not something that I necessarily find satisfying. So it doesn't really provide a satisfying answer to the meaning of life question for me, if it's just external meaning. Whereas if it's internal meaning, maybe it would be a kind of meaning that I would be satisfied with. It would feel genuine to me. All right, so that's an important distinction between internal meaning and external meaning. Another important distinction is between objective meaning, which is meaning that you discover. It's something that like exists independently of your saying that it exists. And then subjective meaning, which is just meaning created by an individual person. The idea is that your life would have meaning just as long as you think it has meaning, or you create your meaning in your own life rather than discover it. That's subjective meaning. And there are various hypotheticals to think about that call into question this idea that there is any subjective meaning to be had in our lives. So one example is what's called the myth of Sisyphus. And the myth of Sisyphus is this old myth where this human named Sisyphus did some naughty things in this life and then was condemned by the ancient Greek gods to roll a rock up the side of a hill for the rest of eternity. Right? Nothing's going to come of it. He just continues to roll this rock up the side of this hill and then watches it roll back down. And that's what he does. This is like painstaking work, requires all of his energy. And so Sisyphus does this day in and day out, and it's a pointless, futile activity that he is condemned for eternity to do. All right, now consider the following possibility. Suppose the gods show some mercy on Sisyphus, and they zap him, with some electricity or whatever, and this act of zapping him makes him enjoy rolling the rock up the hill. And so he finds it deeply satisfying. Question, now that Sisyphus enjoys rolling the rock up the hill, is it now meaningful? Is it worthwhile for him to do it? Well, from his perspective, he might enjoy it. But from our perspective, the outsider's perspective, we can see that he's still doing the same pointless activity that he was before. It's just now he enjoys it. Just because he enjoys it doesn't make it worthwhile or meaningful. Or consider somebody who just enjoys plucking blades of grass out of the ground. Or somebody who just enjoys watching paint dry. They enjoy it. Just because they enjoy it, it doesn't mean it's a meaningful or worthwhile activity. Right? The quality of being enjoyable is different from the quality of being genuinely meaningful or worthwhile. All right, so now that we have this other distinction on the table for us, we can sort of appreciate the value of Aristotle's view. Right? Aristotle is rejecting the idea that your life would have meaning just because you think it does. He's also rejecting the idea that your life would have meaning just because you're enjoying what you're doing, just because you're living a life of pleasure, right? Maybe what you're doing isn't necessarily, you know, inserting any objective meaning into your life. Right? So he thinks that there is objective meaning to human living, and that the best kind of life for a human is becoming more and more virtuous, more and more excellent. That's a kind of there are objective standards that specify when somebody's becoming more virtuous as opposed to less virtuous. And so that's Aristotle's view, and how we could apply some of these distinctions to concerning meaning in life to Aristotle's view. All right, another complaint that's sometimes raised against virtue ethics is that it's not that useful in terms of thinking about morality. What's the right thing for me to do versus the wrong thing for me to do? And the reason why it doesn't seem all that useful is that it just, virtue theory tells you to try and hone your virtuous skills, right? To like try and become more honest or more compassionate, more empathetic. Now, when faced with a moral dilemma like, should I flip the switch and turn the trolley to save 5 lives at the expense of one? What does virtue ethics say? It doesn't give me a very straightforward answer about what I should do in that situation. Right? Like, would it be the fair thing for me to do to flip the switch? Would it be the kind thing for me to do to flip the switch? Like, what if the fair thing is different from what the kind thing is? What if there's like a conflict between those two things? Then what does virtue ethics say I should do when there are conflicting virtues? Right. So the complaint is that it doesn't seem that useful when it comes to thinking about what's right and what's wrong. Right now, maybe this is not really a problem for virtue ethics. So the complaint seems to be the view doesn't give us a nice, clean kind of algorithmic decision procedure that we could use to figure out what's right or what's wrong, like utilitarianism does. Right? It just tells us just do whatever maximizes happiness in the world. That's pretty straightforward. But maybe when it comes to living an ethical life, maybe there is no such algorithmic decision procedure. There is no rule book for living a good life. Maybe living a good life is analogous to, like playing a good game of basketball. Right? So take somebody like, LeBron James, this excellent basketball player. It's not like there's a rule book that he could write down that if somebody else studied it and followed it would allow them to become an excellent basketball player. It requires being an excellent basketball player just requires an ability to know what to do in the situation. Like imagine 2 seconds left on the clock and LeBron can either shoot or pass to the teammate under the basket, and he just sees what the right thing to do is in order to win the game. Things might be similar in the case of deciding whether to flip the switch and turn the trolley. Maybe the individual who's practiced the virtues would be similar to, LeBron in this scenario, somebody who's practiced enough games of basketball to just know what to do, even if there's no algorithmic decision procedure that tells him exactly what to do, or that tells the person in the trolley scenario what exactly to do. Right? So, in other words, virtue ethics, even if it doesn't seem all that useful because it doesn't tell us exactly what the most, straightforward decision procedure is, because according to virtue ethics there is none, maybe the idea that there should be one is a mistake. All right, nevertheless, some people who aren't fans of virtue ethics persist in thinking that since virtue ethics isn't that useful in allowing us to decide what exactly the right action is in particular situations, it therefore is kind of an incomplete ethical theory. Even though that's one complaint against virtue ethics, we just saw how a virtue ethicist might kind of respond to that complaint. So virtue ethics really kind of challenges us to think about the place of rules in morality, or the place of decision procedures like utilitarian decision making in morality. Independently of that kind of issue, does virtue ethics tell us what the right thing to do is? There are certain virtues of the theory, right? Virtues of virtue ethics, when it comes to theorizing about morality. Right? So one huge upshot of virtue ethics concerns what's commonly called moral motivation. Right? And moral motivation is just a kind of motivation to do the right thing. Right? So compare virtue ethics to a moral theory like Kant's theory, for instance. Now, Kant's theory tells us we have a duty to do something just in case it's required by the categorical imperative. Right? Now, imagine doing something like visiting a sick family member in a hospital out of a sense of duty to what you're morally obligated to do. Right? So you show up to visit them and you say, well, I don't really want to be here. I wish I was just like, at the party down the street. But I felt like I had a sense of duty to be here. I thought about the categorical imperative and whether or not I have some kind of duty to visit a sick family member, and I discovered that I do have a duty, so that's why I'm here, even though I don't want to be here. All right, now that seems like a pretty bad motivation, bad motive for being there. Whereas someone might visit their sick family member out of a sense of love or compassion. Right? And they show up and they say, I'm here to visit you because I love you, and I'm very sad that you're sick. I hope you get better. I want to spend time with you while you're here to kind of cheer you up. That seems to be a good motivation to be there. Right? So the motive for going there out of love or sympathy or empathy or loyalty, that's a good motivation. Right? So virtue ethics, one kind of theoretical upshot or advantage of the view is that it can point to what good motivation looks like when somebody's trying to do the right thing. So, in addition to doing the right thing, why we're doing it, the feelings that we have that motivate us to do the thing seem to matter. And virtue ethics gives us a way of explaining which feelings are the right ones to have in a situation like the one we were just thinking about. Whereas other theories like utilitarianism and Kant's theory, they're just focused on the actions. And maybe the intentions behind the actions, but not necessarily the feelings that motivate, doing one kind of thing over another, or choosing or intending to do one kind of thing over another. And so that's just another theoretical advantage of virtue ethics. All right, so that's it for this chapter. We've gone over quite a bit in this chapter as it pertains to virtue ethics, but the main takeaways have to do with Aristotle's conception of what virtues are, right? Virtues in terms of being midpoints between two behavioral extremes. And also we've talked about, what Aristotle's reasons are for thinking that living virtuously is the kind of correct way of living for human beings. All right, so that's it for this chapter.